Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. The Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Now, one of the consistent themes of the Good Faith Podcast is that Christians make sense of the world, not just as individuals, but also through institutions. And that's because we reflect the character of God, not just as individuals, but also as institutions. That human institutions are just that, they're human, and therefore they participate in the human call to reflect who God is in their own way. It also means that human institutions participate in this grand biblical story of humanity, which includes sin and the need for redemption. So this is why there is such a thing as institutional sin. In fact, if you go back to the archives of Good Faith, our very first episode was titled Liberty University and the Reality of Institutional Sin. And it points to that fact that while all institutions, including secular institutions, do have some role in reflecting who God is, Christian institutions bear an especial responsibility because they are in relationship with Christ in a conscious way. We have a special responsibility to reflect who God is, which means we have to take really seriously the nature of institutional sin. And there's a particular kind of institutional sin that's been getting more and more recognition, and that is the sin of spiritual abuse. This is an important topic that I think for any Christian, it's an important topic for me personally, as it's a sort of reality that has made a painful dent in my own family's life, and I'll talk about that later in today's podcast. But I wanted somebody to help us explore this topic of spiritual abuse, and I think we have our great guest to help us. This is Dan Koch. He's the host of the You Have Permission podcast. And Dan, you've said this to me before, that you think that You Have Permission is like we're like related kind of, but just on a different position, perhaps on the theological, ideological spectrum. Is that correct? Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I had the pleasure of having you on. The episode's not aired yet, but we just recorded it a couple weeks ago, and I feel like we are sort of spiritual brother and sister podcasts. I think I reach people further to the left, and you reach people further to the right. I mean that both sociopolitically and theologically,
Mm-hmm.
but we're both trying to engage in good faith. No pun intended, but
Yeah.
good faith discussions, often across disagreement, which I actually think is super rare in religious podcasting.
Yeah, so that's really wonderful, and so glad you're here. And I really enjoyed my time on the You Have Permission podcast, so recommend that to folks as well. But Dan, I think, is a great conversation partner on this topic. He is getting his PhD in counseling psychology and is a practicing therapist. And he published in May of 2022 in the Journal of Scientific Study of Religion what I think is one of the first sort of clinical tools to actually try to measure spiritual harm and abuse. It's called the Spiritual Harm and Abuse Scale for a clinical screener. And I thought, well, Dan's both experience as a researcher and a therapist would make for a great conversation partner on this topic of spiritual abuse. So, Dan, I want to ask you first, why did you start researching this topic? What motivated you?
Ultimately, it was my own history of being on the other end of spiritual abuse. And I'll say right away, I had it better than a lot of people have had it. I was raised in a moderate evangelical environment. I call it California evangelicalism, which is a very inexact term. But, my dad was a therapist. He was not kind of anti-science. My mom liked the occasional swear word joke. But I was raised evangelical and in a non-denominational setting. And for me, a family history and proneness to anxiety, this is something that we talked about on my show, our shared history there. For me, how that manifested was my kind of genetic predisposition, as well as being raised by my mom, who actively fought anxiety during my childhood, was that once the end times teachings got into the water, they were introduced to me in, I think, an extremely immature, and poorly thought out
Mm.
and developmentally inappropriate way.
Yeah.
And man, it was like the meteor that killed the dinosaurs. It smacked in there, and it caused repercussions for a decade and a half, I would
Wow.
say, seriously, in my life. And so that was kind of the motivating factor. And then I got into the research as I was kind of working on my dissertation topic, and found that actually there was just very little about
Yeah.
spiritual abuse. Nobody really knew how common it was. There were no peer-reviewed measures
Yeah.
for determining someone's exposure to it.
Yeah.
Some stuff has been cropping up under kind of different titles, and we can talk about that. But at the time, this was 4 years ago, my doctoral advisor was like, you should do a scale. So that's the direction that I went.
I want to dive into that. I'm almost tempted to go dive into the spiritual impact of that end times teaching, because I experienced that
Mm-hmm.
myself. I still have memories of like reading this very luridly drawn comic book from I think it was the Hal Lindsey Late Great Planet Earth, and just like having nightmares from its
Mm-hmm.
depictions of the end times as a 9-year-old. So we could go off on a different route there, but we're gonna try to stay on this topic of spiritual abuse, because I think it does require a particular form of examination. I'm really grateful that you're doing this work on trying to produce some ways to screen it, because the distinctive nature of spiritual abuse is that it's very hard to trace. It's very hard to diagnose with sort of physical evidence, right? With financial abuse, you can look at the accounting records and you can see embezzlement right there on the numbers. Physical abuse, there's medical records. Sexual abuse, again, there's documented incidents that clearly the sexual abuse happened. I mean, for those of you who want a great example of documentation of sexual abuse at an institutional level, follow the work of my friend Nancy French and her investigation of the Kanakuk camps. And so that's clear. That is, to me, indisputable. You get into spiritual abuse, it leaves no marks. There's no accounting of it. So, Dan, help us think about this. What is the definition of spiritual abuse, and how do we know it's happening?
Well, let's put a pin in it leaves no marks, because I would argue it actually does leave marks that, at least in terms of in a conversation, or someone might self-report, just like I can diagnose someone with PTSD, it leaves similar kinds of marks. But yes, not like a bruise on the face or around the neck, right? And not like a bank statement.
Yes, it leaves internal psychic marks that are harder to see, harder to measure.
Yes. So let's start with a definition, and my definition is mainly taken from Lisa Oakley and her collaborators, as well as Paula Swindle. And it's the following: a form of emotional and psychological abuse perpetrated by a religious leader or group, and or with a religious or spiritual component, usually involving coercion or control. So break that down a little bit. It's emotional and psychological abuse is a category of abuse recognized by psychologists and social workers and lawyers and all that stuff. And so this is not physical. It's not domestic violence. It's not sexual abuse. It is a way of basically damaging someone with words, ideas, emotions, stuff like that. And so it goes in that category for the reasons basically that you said. It doesn't leave a physical mark. There's no sexual activity. So the way that I would conceive of it is, if somebody is, let's say, molested by a priest, they are both sexually abused and distinctly spiritually abused. The sexual abuse will cause the types of effects on a person that sexual abuse tends to cause. And the spiritual abuse, since they were a clergy person, that will lead to other kind of fairly repeatable, and you can kind of guess the type of effects that might have on someone's emotional well-being and their ability to practice their faith. And that right there is, for me, the key point. I am pro-religion. Some people in this world are kind of thinly veiled anti-religion. I wouldn't say most. I wouldn't say it's, I wouldn't like not take the research seriously because of it. In fact, both Lisa Oakley and Paula Swindle don't have that view, and all the good researchers are not sort of having an axe to grind. But it's just worth saying very clearly that I think religion is by and large very good for people. I think that's pretty evident from the empirical research, as well as my own personal experience and convictions. So the biggest issue for me about spiritual abuse is that it can forestall someone's ability to turn to God to heal from the specific abuse that was just done on them.
Right.
Right. That's the pernicious element.
Well, this gets back to my introduction, I think, right? Because sin is always a distortion of the good. It is a perversion of the good, as Augustine would say. And so the good is religion, the good is God, and the good is institutions and institutional leaders imaging something of God. But precisely because sin is a distortion of the good, when sin distorts that imaging process, it's like a magnification. It taps into the power intended by God for the good, but it channels it, it distorts it into the bad. And so it has outsized spiritual impact precisely because it is being done by a spiritual institution and institutional leaders, versus if somebody else without any spiritual cloaking practiced that form of coercion and control. Is that an accurate summary of what you just said?
I think so. And, imagine it this way. You walk past a street preacher with a big sign and a megaphone. Now, that person might basically be attempting to spiritually abuse you, but you don't care because you don't necessarily, I mean, you might happen to agree with something on the sign, but the person doesn't have any authority. They are a rando on the street. And if you're me, they actually have less authority if they think that is a good use of their time. Right. But religion, practiced religion and spirituality, the way that I describe it, I'm glad you used the word power, because I describe it as like nuclear fission.
Yeah.
Nuclear fission, when used correctly, produces the cleanest, most abundant, most environmentally friendly energy that human beings have ever invented.
Yeah.
And when it goes wrong, produces nuclear fallout, the most destructive thing that human beings have ever come up with. Religion, by its very nature, deals in the ultimate questions, but also the ultimate values and aims of a person. And so it just has stronger levers than other things. If you were emotionally abused by, I don't know, someone who does cosmetics, what's that? Cosmologist, right?
right.
Cosmologist? No, that's
no, that's right. You've got it. Well,
right? No,
whatever. We know what we're talking about. Yeah. By my accountant or by my
Okay.
Yeah, right.
So your barber is having a really bad day and really trying to utilize their power over you and whatever. Like, okay, I mean, but like, I just go to you for a haircut and maybe some conversation. I go to my pastor for when my marriage is failing, like I go to my pastor when I don't know what to do with my kids, who are the most important thing to me in the world. So the levers are they just get at stronger stuff. And that's the mechanism in my mind of why it's so powerful.
I love that analogy of nuclear power. It's a great analogy, and it captures some of my feelings on this topic, because my church that I used to be the pastor of, now I have been for the last 15 years, just been a member of, has gone through this fallout. We had a youth pastor who was very charismatic, grew the ministry very powerfully. I actually was the one who was on the hiring committee, chairing the hiring committee that hired him. And we all entrusted our kids to him, and he grew the ministry, and we seemed to be seeing good fruit from it. But underneath there was the pattern, very subtly, the pattern of spiritual abuse that only emerged in recent years, and took a long investigation to uncover of it. And one of the most painful aspects of this was my own kids were affected. And the metaphor of a fallout is really good, because what it has tainted for them. It has contaminated for them all of their memories of their church, all of their current relationships with the church, and then God himself, and such that the gospel has this sort of radioactive glow to it that they want to avoid it. And they're still trying to figure out, I think, in their own way. We're trying to give them the space to do so, to figure out what their own life of faith will be or won't be. And it does have that like we can't even really touch it very well, or we don't quite know how to handle it. I mean, they've seen therapists. The church, to its credit, really as part of its trying to repent and restore from that institutional failure, has made counseling available, has acknowledged it, has conducted an investigation,
that's
brought
great.
its domination. It's in some ways a model of, I think, a good process of institutional repentance. But it also is a model of, boy, how institutions get into this, because I pride myself. I'm a consultant. I'm a former pastor, and I didn't see it. And so, Dan, help me diagnose myself and my own experience of institutions. Why did not obviously use me as a
Yeah.
archetype?
Let's
Why
get
is
under
this
the
so
hood,
missable?
Curtis.
Get me under the hood. I'm not.
I will not be
I'm in Dan's.
psychoanalyzing you
This
on
is a
air,
dance
I
therapy
promise.
session. Yeah,
No,
I'm getting a free
no.
therapy session out of this. Why is it so easily missable? What's going on there?
Well, if we zoom all the way out, I could reference something that you said in your introduction, which I think was very well stated, which is that institutions, they do reflect people in certain ways, and Christian institutions have an obligation to reflect Christ in some way. But institutions, as you well know, covering them, thinking about them, and your colleague David French, writing about them, thinking about them a lot, they have their own incentive structures that kind of come naturally as part of the institution. And I think this is something that no individual sets up. It's kind of like, it's the way that water runs downhill, it's gravity. So if we, to take a non-spiritual example, think about the Industrial Revolution before any kind of labor laws were figured out, right? Like those early capitalists, their incentives were to work people to the bone.
Yeah.
They had more workers than they needed because they were the first. So they are dispensable, right? So the incentive structures of that new burgeoning, steel mill economy, whatever. I don't know a lot about the Industrial Revolution. I don't know about the actual things they made. Trains? Anyway.
Steel,
using steam power to make steel, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Like, you get all this child labor and you get just a complete disregard for the poor and the working class. And that leads to Dickens and all this great literature and, this realism stuff. So institutions have their own incentives, and ministries often have incentives. Like you said, he was growing the ministry.
Right.
So that right there, you've pointed to an incentive for both good and bad reasons. Youth groups want to see growth. They believe the church believes they've got something valuable for the youth, and they'd like more of the youth to be there experiencing it. I had a very good experience in youth group, so I understand that. There were some weird things, and I look back at them now. Of course, I won't be able to escape that with my own children. My son will think there were weird things, and I don't know which ones they are. But like, we think we've got something good, and we are incentivized to grow it, right? But then there are other incentives, like, so consider the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, that big report that came out. It appears that an organization of that size has very strong incentives to, for instance, protect itself legally.
Right.
And all the documentation about, these lawyers who essentially, I'm sure that it was the board or whomever that made the decisions, but they went with the lawyer's advice. That's sort of the takeaway I got from reading the reporting. And the lawyers were like, well, you don't want to admit that you've done anything wrong. You can maybe keep this list that might sort of shield you, but don't make it public because then you're admitting wrong. And it's like, wow, those incentives were really bad for protecting members of the Southern Baptist Convention. What they did was they protected the leadership board from legal liability. And so I think that's like broadest way is to think about incentives. And then what we have to do if we want to stop spiritual abuse is we have to set in place things like worker protections in the Industrial Revolution, right? We have to set rules that will address those things and counteract those natural incentives for the larger long-term incentive of a healthy, thriving community of faith.
Yeah. I like the diagnostic lens of following the incentives and trying to see where these incentives could go astray, because these incentives by themselves oftentimes are either benign or even positive, but like what sin does, it can distort what is good into evil. And I'm thinking about my own experience and thinking, I suppose at some level, one of the reasons we missed it institutionally as leaders of the church was because, things seem to be thriving. There's growth and numerical growth. But I think for myself, when I do any bit of self-reflection, the distortion in the incentive was even more subtle than that, because it wasn't so much, I just love growth. It was because here's my incentive as a parent is I want my kids to fall in love with Jesus, the radical call of Jesus and the radical lifestyle changes that emanate from a countercultural, truly countercultural gospel. That's the experience I had, especially in university. And my fear, my fear as a California evangelical, Dan,
Yeah.
is that gets watered down. That because that's so rare to find in churches, a kind of a call to the radical discipleship of Jesus in a truly healthy and authentic way, right? And that's the key, healthy and authentic. And so what I thought I saw happening here was that like, wow, there's a strong call. There's a call to commitment. There's a call to discipleship and so forth. And what I miss, because I so much long for that for my kids, is the way that was being contaminated by spiritual by abuse, by actually psychological manipulation. That was very subtle, right? Very subtle, by drawing ins and very sharp in and out boundaries, by very subtle practices of shaming that that ended up actually compelling the outward behavior that looked like radical commitment and renouncing of the cultural idols of Silicon Valley. It looked like that, but the underlying drivers was actually more of this psychological, spiritual manipulation and abuse, which is so hard to detect, especially when you're a parent and you want to see what you want to see. You want to see like, oh, that's good. That's what I'm getting. My kids are getting what I long for them getting. And then instead you get this contaminated, corruptive shit. It's so tragic. It's so painful. It's probably the most painful thing I am dealing with in my spiritual life these days, is just trying not to fall into regret, recrimination, self-recrimination. Like, my gosh, of all people, this was my job as a parent and as a somebody with some theological chops and a consultant. Like, I should have spotted this. And yet it just goes to show you, when there are good incentives in play, but they can just get easily manipulated and distorted, there's a lot of blindness that can happen. It's pretty profound and sobering to me, the level of blindness that we can have. This is not, there are some very extreme cases that are like, oh my gosh, how could you see that not happening? But I think a lot of spiritual abuse happens more on this gradient. And in particular, because you want churches that are thriving and calling to discipleship in a strong way. Like, I think if a very like milk toasty sort of sort of tepid version of Christianity, like, you're protected from spiritual abuse because you're not having much spiritual impact, frankly. And it's precisely when you have spiritual impact, you have the temptation to have spiritual abuse. Does that make sense, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so one of the weirdest things that has happened to me, having been raised evangelical and very much, in the 90s. So I was born in 83. So my kind of Christian youth group and Christian school formation is roughly the years of 1990 to 2005. Let's call it. And I remember being very specifically warned against like these Sunday Christians in air quotes, which is funny because like if they were going once a week, that's pretty great
these days.
But the idea was, and then of course even worse were the Easter and Christmas ones, but what it was really getting at was, it was a model of parent. That's I think what was really operative was, there was a type of Christian parent that they wanted their kids safe. They think it would be good to have them in youth group, but they weren't on fire for the Lord, Curtis.
Yeah.
And what's so funny is, as I've gotten older, as I've become a parent, and as I've researched spiritual abuse and other, and been doing the podcast and all that, those are the Christian parents I am now most comfortable with, because I've been kind of inoculated against, I don't know what to call it, maybe like, not vibrant, but kind of, I'm lacking the word right now, fanaticism. Okay. So on fire for God could be really, you're really on fire, or it could be kind of like activism and fanaticism, which can distort reality towards some ideological end. And so I do think there's something there, that, higher church traditions like the United Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church and stuff like that, there's a lot less charisma, generally speaking, no shade intended on those denominations, as opposed to a fiery tent preacher in an unaffiliated Baptist congregation, or something like that. And I do think there's a little bit of a natural give and take, a push and pull, a sort of it's a cost benefit analysis, essentially. I recently talked about this with Chris Green, who grew up Pentecostal, on You Have Permission. And we kind of analyzed these different church cultures through that lens of like high risk, high reward, essentially. So I don't know, you could respond to that. I have some other ideas about the radical
No,
call
I
of
think that's
Jesus,
right.
but
I think just to retie it also, I think there's institutional dimensions to this as well, in that it's the sort of the entrepreneurial nature of evangelicalism
yes,
allows
absolutely.
for charismatic individuals to create institutions very quickly, often on a germ of a good idea, of a
Sure.
good
Yeah.
influence, right? But again, because they are entrepreneurial and therefore not under tight supervision, under strong institutional practices, they don't have the spiritual equivalent of child labor laws kind of hovering over them and constraining their range of activities. They can easily go astray. They're more prone. There's much higher risk. So in that risk reward calculation, there's the reward of entrepreneurial energy and innovation. There comes with it a high degree of risk of abuse, especially spiritual abuse. That is the hard one to catch. So
when you were talking about a radical call of Jesus, countercultural to Silicon Valley, and by the way, I grew up in Silicon Valley too, in San Jose area. Right. I thought about Greg Boyle down in LA doing Homeboy Industries.
That's right. Good example.
Yeah. Greg Boyle, but if we break down Greg Boyle, he is not a non-denominational lone wolf, lone man called by God. He's a Jesuit. Or is he a Jesuit or a Franciscan? Whichever one. For the purposes here, it doesn't matter. He is. He's a monk. He is in an order of the Catholic Church with strict rules. They have a very long process of discernment before you can become one. So you have this vow of celibacy and poverty that, so he is not allowed to own anything, essentially, and he has to go through this long process to discern if that's really what God is calling him to do with a bunch of wiser and older people than him. And then once he gets in there and he's assigned to a parish and he has these ideas, there are people over him. There is a big structure that goes, okay, yes, no, do you need help? Here's some help. He could be, in theory, defrocked. He could be excommunicated from the Catholic Church, which is something very weird to us Protestants, but like that's a real disincentive for somebody who has dedicated their life to the church. Right. And for all the problems of the Catholic Church, and of course, spiritual and sexual abuse, very much not immune, but though that's very different than anybody you had hired at your non-denominational church. Yeah. Just the levels of institutional structure around him.
Well, but your example, though, you got to it at the end, just shows you how devious institutional abuse is, precisely because the institution has so much solidity and weight and authority. When it does go bad, the ramifications are even worse. It's like nuclear power. It's like a huge nuclear power plant that melts down at that point, which we've seen, of course, with the combination of sexual and cover-up abuse, institutional abuse in the Catholic Church. That, boy, my gosh, we'll be cleaning up the contamination from that fallout for decades.
Yes.
Dan, we've been talking about a lot of these institutional dimensions. Let's go back to the individual level. Both you and I have personal experience from a different dimension. Myself as a parent, you as a direct sufferer of spiritual abuse in church. But I want you to draw on your therapist experience and just unpack for us, what is the fallout? What is, at the individual level, what does spiritual abuse do to those who've suffered it?
The simplest way of putting it is that it tends to manifest in very similar ways to PTSD. So I have had more than one client who met all the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, except for the first criteria, which is criterion A, which is, an experience of real or threatened death, or sexual assault, or I don't have the DSM in front of me, but it's basically like real, you or someone you love, you thought they were going to die, or you were going to die, or you were sexually assaulted, basically. And there's some internal conversation in the trauma psychology community about whether that should be changed in some way.
Yeah.
But all the other stuff, the avoidance behaviors, the triggering, avoiding certain people, spaces, or concepts, intrusive thoughts. Sometimes there's nightmares. Basically, all the classic symptoms of trauma. And again, I think that's because, and this is just my personal opinion. It would probably take a while to prove this, but I think it's because of that power that we talked about. That, yeah, religion, yeah, unless you're sexually abused, that would qualify for proper PTSD. But we're just dealing with the levers on these really important, deep values and trajectories of life, and ways we narrate the world and our own value in it and our role in it. So it does kind of rise to that level. And there is some other evidence I can find if you want, about why it might be, or just kind of proving that point that it is that powerful. But we don't have to get into the weeds if we don't need to.
Yeah. And how long, I mean, what have you found as how long the ramifications go? What's the path that these victims take? Uh, Sketch that out a little bit.
Well, in a therapeutic context, I was treating it with standard trauma care. So I have some training in a modality called cognitive processing therapy, which is developed for regular PTSD. There's a version of it specifically developed to work with war veterans. But really, it's just kind of standard trauma care. And that, for instance, if you do that with someone, it's anywhere from like 12 to 16 weeks, usually, with weekly sessions, and you're doing homework. It might be worth, I mean, I don't know how far into the weeds you want to get on this, but there's exposure therapy, and we can talk about how that kind of works in terms of healing. And then it's basically CBT, it's cognitive behavioral therapy. It's working with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors at the thoughts level. Yeah.
And how have you experienced folks able to reconstruct their faith life? And if so, what does that look like if the whole thing gets tainted with this trauma and toxicity? What is the recovery process like once you get out of the specific, deep trauma work that I think you're talking about? How does one recover one's faith life coming out of that experience?
Sure. So now I'm going to be drawing on a mix of client work and just kind of talking with people over the years doing You Have Permission, and a little bit of my own experience as well. So maybe the way we might sketch kind of a standard trajectory would be something like this. If you have a really traumatic religious experience or spiritually abusive experience, and let's say you meet PTSD criteria other than that AA one, and you would be dealing with that literally until you do trauma work. So time can heal traumatic wounds, but if we zoom out into just the larger trauma sphere, I mean, there's just abundant stories of 75-year-old Vietnam War vets, finally dealing with the trauma that has been in their system for 50 or 60 years. So trauma, that's kind of the dominant understanding. It doesn't go away. The best-selling book right now on the subject is called The Body Keeps the Score.
Right.
It's very aptly titled. So that's kind of our best understanding of trauma. Now, spiritual abuse does not always produce trauma. I want to be clear. That's why I called my scale spiritual harm and abuse, because it doesn't always reach abuse or trauma. Sometimes it's just like, wow, that was really lame. And that makes me not want to go back. It can be as mild as that. But let's say it is bad. So then someone works on their trauma. The most efficient way to do that is with a trauma-informed therapist. But I imagine there are other ways to kind of get some of that benefit through people in your life. I wouldn't recommend it. I'd recommend using a therapist. Then, so then as you're healing from trauma, with enough time, and maybe you have some other experiences, something might go, oh man, I missed that. Let me tell you an example from actually my own life to narrate this part.
Yeah.
So we left our church about 5 years ago. It was a PCA church at the time. It has since changed to an Anglican church through their own kind of process. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. I was starting the podcast. I disagreed with the church on a lot of things, and it just felt weird. I started going back with my son. And because we'd kind of gotten through COVID and we hadn't found another church, like a more progressive church that we really liked. And I realistically thought, we're not going to, because we're moving in about a year and a half. So we're going to go back to our old church. And I'm sitting in there one Sunday, not particularly expecting to enjoy it, but I'm there for my son. And it's Palm Sunday, and we read this passage from Isaiah, and it's about the wounded servant, the suffering servant. And in the beginning of the passage, there's this description of like what I call like a Quasimodo kind of a figure. He's like disfigured in the Isaiah passage.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, here comes the anxiety. And I could think of two pieces of anxiety. First was, is this really talking about Jesus? I don't know. Jesus didn't seem to be like all that ugly from the other accounts we have. So I had like kind of an internal, I gotta line this up. And then I thought, well, there might be this other one too. I can kind of see it on the horizon. Well, or I come to some progressive understanding of this and the church doesn't. And then there's this dissonance. And I saw those two, but I didn't feel either of them. And I was like, I found myself thinking, aren't religions interesting? Which totally surprised me, but it was an indicator that I had processed something. That's why I tell that a little long-winded story. So I had gotten through something about that kind of need to align my beliefs with the text or the church or whatever. And I had just gotten a bit of space there. And so somebody who has healed, who has processed, will probably find a moment, something like that, where they go, oh, it's just not, I don't need to avoid that anymore. I can go to I can visit my parents' church when we're visiting them, at the holidays, and it doesn't trigger anxiety in me anymore.
Right.
So that would be one way of knowing. Another way would just be you find another expression of the faith that doesn't ping those points for you, and you're able to kind of reapproach the language of, the liturgy or, gospel passages or the Lord's Prayer or what have you. And you just go, oh yeah, okay. And then you probably have had to reinterpret it to some degree to get past whatever you've been through. Hopefully that's helpful. And that was not as concise as I planned it to be.
No, that's good. That's good. I like that. I think I especially like the idea that, paying attention to anxiety within us and paying attention to our avoidance impulses.
Yeah.
My book talks a lot about this, is the ways in which anxiety equals loss times avoidance. And so that we are, the more we can actually lower our avoidance, that's a good sign that our anxiety levels have gone down such that we've healed a little bit. Dan, I want to ask about what you would say. What would you say to the counter argument to an emphasis on spiritual abuse? And maybe the argument would go something like this: is, look, because it is so subjective in the sense of the roots of spiritual abuse are rooted in the experience of the victims themselves. Because that is not an objective marker, like we said, like a physical marker or an act done upon you that you can see, like sexual abuse, it is prone to all sorts of ways that human beings construct meaning, and that those meanings can change. Their culture, there's a cultural construction on that. And so the example of this would be, when I have talked to victims of spiritual abuse, I have this tension in me, because partly, especially like talk to my kids, I'm like, I feel their pain. It's real. That pain is real. It is true for them. And at the same time, if I were to take that, what was done to them, and apply it to me, it would have had a different impact on me, or somebody else, right? Or somebody in a different cultural era, it would have had a different impact, because a lot of what is experienced as power and coercion, say by, let's call it, this generation of kids or of youth, somebody in their, like my age, would have thought, that sounds a lot like just management. That sounds a lot like running an organization, like what a manager does in terms of telling somebody what to do. And sometimes you have to be a little firm and strict. And then, wow, that's experienced as trauma, right? So that would be the counter, or one counter argument is like, to put it crassly, are we just dealing with somebody who's being very oversensitive and not knowing how the real world works? Again, that's it. That's a, I wouldn't agree with that as a standard response, but because there is this spectrum, there's this sort of, it seems to me there are possibility of edge cases or gradients where that response has to at least be weighed somewhere in the equation. What do you think about that, Dan?
I think there are a few threads that I want to pull on there that I think are legitimate, and but we should be careful not to unknowingly combine them with each other. So, first of all, differential impact in trauma. I mean, that's the understanding. Two soldiers witness the exact same atrocity. One of them might get PTSD and the other won't. The Army is actively trying to understand the psychology of what makes someone likely to get PTSD so that they can figure out who to deploy into the field and not. So that's like settled science.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely true. I think there can be for sure an age and maturity function, maybe more in the way that someone talks about it than the validity of their experience. And so, you can take the words of younger people with a grain of salt as descriptors, right? But it's best to think about experience through a developmental lens, that different experiences at different ages will impact you differently because your brain is at a different stage of development. Right. And so, I don't expect my 3-year-old to use a silly example. I don't expect this morning I literally asked him, why don't you want to go pee pee on the potty? And then I thought, Dan, what are you doing? He doesn't know the answer to that. Of course not. Right. Like I am wasting my breath. I am not going to get any clues. So I took a different tack. I was like, hey, does your friend John go pee pee on the potty? And he goes, no, he's a big boy. He wears pants and undies. I was like, oh, interesting. Letting him work it out. Right. So that was a more psychologically astute way of going about it from my perspective. So there are issues there. And then related, as a therapist, there is a kind of TikTok, Instagram, self-diagnosis kind of culture right now on social media that is sometimes helpful. People come in with ideas that we can build on, and sometimes unhelpful. They have wrongly diagnosed themselves, in my opinion, and other clinicians' opinions. And there can be a concept creep, as Jonathan Haidt talks about in Coddling of the American Mind, that what constitutes trauma. We don't want to water that down too much, because real trauma is really, really damaging. I sometimes talk about capital T and lowercase t trauma as a shorthand, but that's again why I put harm in the name of the scale, right? So I do think that those are realities. I also think you could probably have found people who were like, yeah, the Inquisition, it's not ideal, but just tell them you're Catholic, just do it, or just buy the indulgence, you can do it. I think as Protestants, it's actually pretty hypocritical of us to not be open to challenges to institutional, glut and I don't know, unhealth. So I would also push back in that way of like, okay, but we still have to figure out, is this something more like the Inquisition, or is this something like, young kids want to ride skateboards in the parking lot and we're not letting them, right? Those are very different.
Dan, in this last segment, I want to get practical here. And I want to think about all the different players that are involved in a situation of spiritual abuse. And let's try to break down, like, what are some practical advice we can give people? So let's start with people that should be at the center of our concern, the victims. I mean, if you're listening to this and you either have known for a while that you've been a victim of spiritual abuse, or even this conversation is starting to make you realize, wait a minute, I think what they're talking about, I went through as a teenager or recently even. What would be your words to them?
I'd want to make two categories. So if you are just like, oh, that's interesting, that might have impacted me a bit, or you want to learn more about it, you can go to dankochwords.com. I'm sure you guys can put a link in the notes, and I have a spiritual abuse screener dedicated page there. You can look at the screener. It also has a little bit of research, and there's descriptors of each of the 6 factors. There's like 4 types of abuse and 2 types of common reaction to abuse, exposure to abuse. So that would be for the more casual person. Also, by the way, if you're a therapist, it is free to use. You can score it. It gives you sort of scores normed on a sample of about 3,200, not representative of the US population, to be clear. And so that's sort of the first category. There's also some good books like, is it Embracing the Serpent? Lisa Oakley has a great book, called something like Embracing the Serpent. That's
Okay.
like a popular level book that I would very much recommend. And then if you're more like, oh, actually, I've noticed avoidance behaviors around
Mm,
this. I've noticed intrusive thoughts. I have
mm,
had flashbacks to traumatic religious experiences. I've maybe had a nightmare. Um, I have been in a religious situation and felt myself kind of dissociate, like kind of check out for a few minutes and then come back. Then I would recommend looking into trauma treatment with a licensed therapist who is competent in an area of trauma work, be it EMDR or any other form of trauma care. That would be my recommendation, and I wouldn't recommend trying to work on that yourself.
okay. What about if you are somebody who is a loved one, a parent, brother, sister, child, maybe even of somebody who I think they have experienced spiritual use? How do you support such a person well?
That's a really good question. I would say in that case, first of all, your primary duty is not to the institution that may or may not have abused them.
Hmm.
So I would just say, you might, like, let's say you are kind of skeptical that was really abusive. Unless it is literally like it's your small business or something, like it's your livelihood, your role with relation to this person
Yeah.
is a loving and caring friend or
Yeah.
relation or whatever. And I would take them seriously, and I would show them unconditional love
Mhm.
as you talk about it. That doesn't necessarily mean you go sue the church, right?
Mm.
You don't have to go all the way, but that's kind of, I would think, sort of therapeutically, that's your role, and maybe even helping them discern if they need to do more about that.
Yeah.
Like maybe they do need to file a police report. I mean, depending on what the thing is, and that can be very empowering. Maybe it's not. Maybe they just need to talk about it with a few friends. I don't know. Of course, so much depends on the details here, but
Yeah.
I would start there if your primary role is the person and you're not involved in the institution.
Okay. What about for leaders of institutions, pastors, elders, Sunday school teachers, youth group leaders? What is the warning, caution, encouragement that you would have to them around this topic of potential spiritual abuse?
Okay, it's the Lisa Oakley book. So I'm going to find this here and make
Yeah.
sure I have the right word for it.
Yeah.
The term. It's I don't know where Embracing the Serpent. I have no idea where that came from in my deep subconscious. The book is called Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse. And the
Got
cool
it.
thing about this book is that she and her co-author, Justin Humphreys, they actually have not only researched spiritual abuse, but they've researched the inverse. So Christian communities that are robust against spiritual abuse and that are
Okay.
promoting thriving. And so they have a list of principles that they've found through that research. And so that's really the best place to go for people who have any sort of lever of power with an institution, is to find that list of the healthy things that these communities are doing and try and implement those.
All right. Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking us through a very important, complex, and painful topic.
Yeah.
Really appreciate this. We end new guests who come on the Good Faith podcast by asking them 3 questions. And I want to explain why I do this, because I actually haven't ever explained why I ask these 3 questions.
You got to tell the people, man. You got to
I,
let them
I,
know.
I got to let them know. I got to empower the people. The reason I do this, and there are questions that are about, good news, hope, and joy. Good news, hope, and joy. And the reason I do this is because I found at some point in doing this podcast that our conversations so gravitate towards problem analysis, which is
Totally.
necessary. You need to do this. You need to diagnose the problem.
Yeah.
But I think we're also just wired as kind of the people who are public sort of thinkers and critics. We think in terms of problems of the world. And so what that lends to is sort of this emotional shading of a podcast like Good Faith, which doesn't start after a while. Doesn't feel like this doesn't sound so good as you believe it to be, right? It's
Yeah.
like we're just talking about all the problems, and so these questions for me are a way for us to re-anchor in the good of the good faith, and these are good news, hope, and joy, which are so crucial. These are the pillars of what the Christian life, what a life of knowing and following and being loved by Jesus entails. Is it's supposed to be good news, hope, and joy. So this is a way for me to discipline myself and our conversations to end on the reality, on the true truth, which does not deny, it does not minimize the bad news. In fact, it in some ways rests on the bad news. The good news is the good news precisely because it's a response to the bad news of the world. And
Yeah.
so I want to end on the good news. And so, Dan, my first question to you is about good news. What piece of good news do you have to share with our listeners?
I want to use this to actually comment a little bit on your whole spiel. Is I don't mean it negatively. that whole pitch though, which is that in therapy, oftentimes I will use a client's worst feelings, their darkest, deepest pain. Like that's where we want to go precisely because that gives us clues to treatment and to improvement. So I actually think that, we can't just stop at diagnostics, but we should actually follow the clues there. So I'll often use like an emotion wheel with a client and they go, I'm feeling sad. Okay, you're feeling sad, but let's go further. And there's like more and more specific emotions go, actually, I'm feeling betrayed. Oh, betrayed by whom? About what? And usually there, if you flip that over, you find a value. You find something that the person really cares about. Well, I was betrayed actually by the leader of my biking group. I felt like he really threw me under the bus, no pun intended, on this last ride or something. And it's like, oh, well, maybe you really value like closeness or group cohesion or like compassionate leadership. Are you called to be a compassionate leader of something like your bike group? Whatever it is, right? So you follow it. And so for me, the emphasis on both spiritual abuse and other scandals, especially in the Protestant world, like I think about Julie Roys and her work at the Roys Report. Like this to me is good news because we have to have a healthy church, a healthy body of Christ. And you got to get the cancer out. Like you just have to. And we see what happens when you don't. It blows up in your face. It's a multiplier. Catholic clergy sex abuse, perfect example. Hillsong, another example. SBC, another example. So that is good news to me. And I think I'm just in the constant habit of taking the worst experiences of my clients and finding the path forward from it. So it's easy for me to think of it that way.
I love that. And I think that, again, is a nice loop back to why institutional sin and especially institutional spiritual abuse is so important, is because there actually is resident power there that we were made to tap into, and we were made to be brought together to reflect God to one another through institutions. And so the fact that we're starting to really zero in on with more precision on the ways that can get distorted, it just shows how good it is. I mean, to use the definition of sin that Augustine used, it's a perversion of the good. And so if we've landed on the perversion, it means we're on the scent, we're on the trail of the good that's there.
I like that. I like that, bringing that in. I mean, the moment of the Protestant Reformation and indulgences and all that, I mean, that was a tough moment. A lot of people wringing their hands about the future of the institution and all that stuff, but like it needed to happen. The Catholic Church needed this. They end up reforming themselves in, to some degree in light of the Protestant Reformation and like toward greater health and less silliness, frankly. So, that can be hopeful.
All right. Well, that's the next topic. Hope. What personal practice sustains your own sense of hope, Dan?
Well, this one I can keep short. It's doing therapy. I've been thinking a lot about hope in my own podcasting, and I was thinking about, hope for this life and the next. And I was kind of parsing that phrase and if I thought I could use that phrase. And I realized hope for this life is easy. I would not be a therapist if I didn't think that essentially every person has hope that things can be better for them. It is the fundamental assumption of anybody doing that kind of work. And I get to do it every week with people. So that actually keeps me quite hopeful.
I love that. All right, joy. What is one movie, book, or some other content that has given you joy recently?
The Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend podcast, I think, is just an absolute home run. I remember when he started it, I was like, this guy's been on television for
Yeah.
25 years or whatever. He's just going to have a podcast. But now I think it's probably like 1, 2, or 3, comedy podcasts in the world. And he is able to just be himself. He's so quick. The people that are on, his co-hosts, are also so quick and so funny. And I just find it like it's just incredibly made. And recently they've started doing episodes like he and Robert Smigel and Dana Carvey and Kevin Nealon back in the 90s, I think 91, they wrote a script for a Hans and Franz movie,
Oh,
the
jeez.
SNL characters who are
That's
going
right.
to
Yes.
pump you
Pump
up.
you up. Yes.
And they've been reading the script in installments on the Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend podcast with like German folk music in the background and like Conan's reading the stage directions, and they're like reading through the script, and that's been so funny and just like that's brought me a little bit of joy.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for sharing us both the bad news that leads to the good news here on Good Faith.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, friends, thank you so much for joining us. And once again, next week, we'll be back right here where we gather around the campfire.